What did we learn in the last Pedic? We learned in the last Pedic that any mitzvah is a merkava for what the Rebbe calls in the Tanya Pnimius Ratzon V'Chavtzi Amiti. We're concerned, Pnimius Ratzon V'Chavtzi Amiti is Achdus. And of course, the relevance of this whole issue to us is that there's no such thing as a small mitzvah. A small bittul ta'atzmus and a big bittul ta'atzmus is a bittul ta'atzmus. Teire is not just a bittul of Pnimius Ratzon V'Chavtzi Amiti, I'm sorry. You become one with Pnimius Ratzon V'Chavtzi Amiti. You become one with Achdus Hashem. V'loi oid ella. Not only Pnimius Ratzon V'Chavtzi Amiti and Achdus V'Eidis and Atzilus, but you become bottled to save of Kalam. Pedek of Dalet is the exact same discussion backwards, but now we're talking about Klippa. When a macht bekitzer. In other words, in today's shir, he's going to say in Liyum Hazeh what he said in the last Pedek in 3 shiurim. The first shikl of Dalet is a review of the whole of Gimel in the Liyum Hazeh, which is typical of the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe gets the Klippa, all of a sudden he runs out of words. Pedek of Dalet, Liyum Hazeh, and one is opposite the other. That just like you have mitzvahs and Teira and V'lo Yoidela, right? Mitzvahs is a merkava for Achdus. Teira is the Elokus and Atzilus. V'lo Yoidela is save of Kalaman. The same is true in the Yom Hazeh. You have Avedis, you have Avedis Zara, and have V'lo Yoidela. Hein Shasam mitzvahs leisa said Deraisa v'chosur derabbanim. The 365 Avedis and Deraisa v'chosur derabbanim. That me'ach Hashem neged the tzeit v'chach mas yizbach, they're against the will and wisdom of the Eibishter. And when we say Ratzon, you mean Pnimius Ratzon v'chavtzi amiti, a.k.a. Achdus. V'afoch mamish, and mamish the opposite we just started. Says the Rebbe, when you do an Aveda, you become a Merkava for Hem Nefrodim Yichud V'Achdus Yizbarach V'Dachas Apidet Mamish. They are separated, and they separate one from the unity and oneness of the Eibishter, blessed be He, with the absolute measure of separateness. And here comes the mantra of Pedek Chav Daled, all zusammen. Don't think that Sitra Achra is only Klippas Nege, and Avodah Zarah is terrible. Just to wissen who are Satan, who are Mahu Yetzer Hara, who are Satan, who are Malach Amavis, who are Nochash Kadmeini, who Hergish Ayesh. It's all saints. So Avodah Zarah and Sitra Achra, which as you pointed out could be Klippas Nege, is one and the same thing. Why? Machmas Hester Ponim. Of course, one can be easier to fix. Another one is not so easy to fix. Bottom line is it has to ponim. It's not mibli has to ponim like we had in the shir of yesterday, 2 days ago. Has to ponim. The countenance of Hashem is concealed. If the countenance of Hashem is concealed, it's an even klip. And the same is true of a person. When we do an aveda, so gimel levusha nefesh and klipas nega should be Yisrael. The 3 garments of the nefesh abahamis of a yid, which is klipas nega. Shem machshava dibero ma'isa. That hamelu bosh b'shis halezis adaraisa derabbanon. When I do an aveda, so my garments become a garment for hepech of pnimius ratzon v'chavtzi amiti. What's the opposite of achdus? What's the opposite of pnimius ratzon v'chavtzi amiti? Sitra acharo klipa nikra v'dezara v'lekim acher. Says the Rebbe kulam yuchad mamish. So my garments, my body becomes one, and of course the diuk is in avedis. It's a merkava. And here goes again. But here he mentions 3 out of 4. Why he doesn't mention Elikim Achedim? That's homework. Okay, in this Pedek he mentioned it 5 or 6 times, with each one with a stickle shinoi. Now, I am going to go out on a limb. I'm going to say something which is not written here, and of course you're not allowed to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And David shall have to forgive me. And that is, it is 2 inyanim in Aveda. One in Aveda is the act. You do an act in Aveda. Even you have no kavanah to be made in the Eibishter. The act is a merkava from reading in the Eibishter. The act is a merkava for the achara klipa nikah v'ezar v'lekim acher. If a yid worships idols, and I don't necessarily mean bowing down to eights forever. When a yid believes and asserts what we had in the end of chapter 22, Perich of Beis, ani v'yafsiyet. But they don't say that Eibishter doesn't exist. They just say that I exist also. Yesh and davar nifrad and bifnei atzmei. So when a yid believes, in other words, when a yid is in a place spiritually of saying, I'm separate from Hashem, Hashem is not my balabos, in practical terms, not everything is bashgacha pratis, they're not a merkava of Avodah Zarah, that's Avodah Zarah itself. In other words, what I'm trying to do is create symmetry. Symmetry means Elu Mazeh. Just like in mitzvahs. Mitzvahs make a merkava for achdus, and there's 3 parts: the kelim of atzilus, the guf of the person, and the chavtzeh shel mitzvah. Same is true in Avedas. There's a kelim of atzilus of klipa. It's called atik of klipa. There's a place where klipa has its own guf. There's your guf, the person's guf in the levushim b'shas to doing the aveda, and there's the chavtzeh shel aveda. It's a merkava for klipa, sitra acharo klipa, which is the opposite of Pnimius Ratzon and V'chaftzia Amiti. When a person has the hashkaf of Avodah Zarah, he's not a merkava of Avodah Zarah, that's Avodah Zarah itself. Now comes the third level. Just like in Kedusha, a mitzvah is a merkava for Achdus. Teir is one with Achdus. V'lo Eid Ela, Teir is save of Kalal Min. The same is true in the Yom Hazeh. But Alter Rebbe macht bekitzer. He doesn't explain it. Because like I said to you before, the Alter Rebbe, when it comes to Klipa, all of a sudden he runs out of words. Aveda is a merkava for Klipa. Avodah Zarah itself is Sitra Achar or Klipa. Hanika Avodah Zarah v'lakim acherim. V'lo Eid Ela, that when a Yid is involved in Avodah Zarah, he's worse than the Avodah Zarah itself. Elisha B'Teilim, that when a Yid is involved in Avedis, and specifically when he's involved in the Ashkaf of Avodah Zarah, P'shas Maaseh, he is bottled, Tfeilim, and secondary to Avodah Zarah. To Sitra Achar or Klipa, Nika Avodah v'lakim acherim, Ugeruim or worse, and worse, or Pchusim and less, Mimena from Sitra Achar or Klipa, Nika Avodah Zarah v'lakim acherim itself, may aid very much. There's a spiritual world of Klipas. A Yid who sins is worse than them, for several reasons. Number one, Ki hi einem lebashes b'gufach chumri. The spiritual realm of Sitra Achar or Klipa, Hanika Avodah Zarah v'lakim acherim is not an aguf. An aguf is a big hamaylam master. Number two, if you could meet Sitra Achar or Klipa, Hanika Avodah Zarah v'lakim acherim in its spiritual realms, it knows Hashem. And number three, it will never go against the Eibishter. Lifel piulasa, to do what it does. By sending its negative shluchim, without the shlichus, without the permission of the Eibishter himself. In other words, what's the third point? There's something called Sitra Achar or Klipa. What does Achar Klipa say? There's Hashem, and then there's me. But it listens to Hashem. But it listens to Hashem, not saying my whole Matthias is Hashem. My whole Matthias is me, but I'm going to listen to Hashem anyway. And when Hashem doesn't tell it what to do, it does what it wants. Like Bilam says, Bilam was a Rasha Merusha, and he says, oh, I'd love to curse the Jewish people if the Eibishter will allow. I can't cross over this line and do what the Eibishter doesn't allow. So a Yid who doesn't have Veda is worse than Sitra Achar Klipa for three reasons. We're in a Guf Chumri, and the mashmos of the Alter Rebbe is that the moment I'm doing the Aveda, the second I'm not thinking about the Eibishter. And number three, I made it be. Hashem said, don't do it, and I'm doing it. Sitra Achar or Klipa will never not do something Hashem told it directly not to do. Chacha filu, Sitra Achar or Klipa is a Metzias unto itself. That's what makes it Klipa. But it knows that God's the boss. Frag the Alter Rebbe v'ashnikra Avodah Zarah. How could you say that a Yid who sins is worse than Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah is the worst thing that could possibly be. Look, the Rebbe, you're wrong. Because Avodah Zarah is not atheism. Avodah Zarah is polytheism. Avodah Zarah is ozav avayah sa'ar. It's not that avayah doesn't exist. Tichar b'avayah le'ma le'hu, as you see momentarily. They call the Eibishter the God of gods. And they know that even though they have free will in their own minds, but they have to do what he wants, like subordinates in a company have to listen to a president. They have free will, but he's the commander. They could never violate his will. They know and understand that he's their life and their existence. That they get life from him at least from the Madrega of Acherayim of Ratzon Helyon. And if you remember Perek Chav, point number one was called the Ribuy Tzimtzumim. Point number two was called Acherayim, and point number three is Hamakef Aleya. That even the little bit of Chayetz which they get in even of Acherayim is hidden in them, called Golos, as we discussed in the shir that we had the other day. Remember? Then, what makes them they should be Kedusha. If Sitra Achar or Klipa is not Melubat B'Guf Chumri, and Yedei Yas Rebbeinu, Ve'einu Meiredas Bei, what's not Kedusha about it? So the teretz is as follows: the nourishment and the life which is inside of them is in a state of Golus inside of themselves. What does it mean, Golus? God exists in me, and God is trapped. He cannot talk, and it hurts. To consider themselves separate from the Eibishter. Yeah, this is mercha tipcha. The tipcha is on achdusay, not on kfira. It's not the kfira b'achdusay. It's the kfira b'achdusay. It's taka kfira, but only in achdus, not in the Eibishter. It's kfira in the oneness of Hashem in His world. It's not kfira in emunah. He believes in God, but he believes God's not in control of His world. Still, they're not complete atheists. Which is, and he quotes now a pasuk: to deny Hashem altogether, say He doesn't exist, which is what we would call atheism. Ella, but rather simply the they refer to Him as the God of gods. In other words, that they know that chayus kiyuma, that they have life, which is their neshama, and existence, which is their guf, and it's taka nimshach v'yered aleim eretzeini yisbarach. It comes to them from the Eibishter. And v'lachein and an even metzeini yisbarach le'elam, they'll never go against Hashem's wishes. But it's not in such a way that their mitzias says, I am God, I am me, but I'm dependent upon God. And that's Avodah Zarah. Shituf means that I do what he says always. The Emes says this is not so pashut. The Rebbe has a Maimer, Basi Legani, Toshin Yud Gimel, where he analyzes this Perek of Dalet, why this is called Avodah Zarah. And frankly, I forgot what he says there at the moment, but he studies why this is Avodah Zarah. If l'cheira they're always doing the wishes of the Eibishter, you know. And the mashmos over there is that it's Avodah Zarah for a Yid. It's not Avodah Zarah for a Goy. But in any case, Shitav would mean that it only does what Hashem says. It has free will. Avodah Zarah means that sometimes it does what it wants against the wishes of Hashem, unless Hashem tells it explicitly, don't do it. But again, they have one in this Perek of Dalet. To understand it correctly, you have to learn Basi Legani Toshin Yud Gimel, which is not fresh in my mind. The mashmos over there is that this is Avodah Zarah for a Yid. For a Goy, this would be Shitav, this would be Mutter. Because he brings Maimer Bilam. You understand? But the Pashtus, what makes it Avodah Zarah is that it doesn't always do what Hashem wants. It does what it wants. Except in those rare cases where Hashem says b'feidish, do kach v'kach, then it cooperates. But otherwise it does what it wants. And that's the end of Avodah Zarah. As opposed to Shittif, where Hashem gives him all of his instructions. The imkain, bottom line is this. A person who violates the wishes of Hashem. Who garua his words to pochas unless haba made very much. Here goes again. This is the third or the fourth time that we have this. At least 3 times. Yeah? Then a Yid sins is in the ultimate measure of separateness. From the oneness and unity of the Eibishter. Yeser mimena more than Avodah Zarah itself. As if it denies Achad Hashem even more than Klippus Achad. And notice, even by the Yid, he doesn't say Ilu Kaifer. He doesn't even want to say the Yid who's a Rosh is an atheist. Even the Yid who's a Rosh is only Kaifer B'Achdusay. But it's more Kfiri in Achdus, as if you could say Madreges in Achdus. And he brings you the Kabbalistic explanation. We're comparing a physical Yid to a spiritual Klippa. A spiritual Klippa is Yedei Asri Beinei, Einu Mechaven Limreit Bei, Ela B'Shlichus Nisham Makam Baruch Hu, what we call Klippas Nega. A Yid is worse than them. Why? Because we're melubash and a guf chumri ve'ein yedei asri beinu mechav limit bei. Bring to the Kabbalah, Moshe Koster Beitz Chaim, Shalom Beis Perek Daled, that sharash be'elam hazeh chumri, the evil in this physical world, which is of course expressed in the Jews' Aveira, who shmarei klipas agas v'chol. It's the worst of the bad klipas. V'utachas abida v'chol. Of course, the point of it all is to fix it eventually. But in the meantime, a Yid down here in Gashmi's world, when he's klipa, is much worse than the spiritual klipas. V'lachein kol ma'aseh elam hazeh kosher b'royim. Everything that occurs in this world, it says in Tanya Perek Vav also, is hard and evil. V'arashoyim gave by ruled by the Shoyim v'chuli, because this is the shmarei aklipas agasas. So what did the Alter Rebbe just do? He said to us like this: a Yid doesn't have Avedas and Makabah for Avodah Zarah. And I'm proposing to you that a Yid who has a hashkafa of Azav Hashem Esaretz is Avodah Zarah itself. V'la Yeideli is worse than Avodah Zarah. Why? Why? Because the Avodah Zarah Ruchni is a Yid is melubash b'guf chumri. Apparently, b'shas the rega d'aveda ein yedei asri beinei, and he's mechaven limud bei. So therefore, Yid is worse, but worse than what? Than the spiritual klipas. On the next page, Rebbe is going to say Yitish Kadmach, that Yid is even worse than physical klipas.